The first sound she heard was laughter. Not the relieved laughter that sometimes escaped exhausted nurses after saving a life, but the sharp, careless kind that lingered just a little too long. It followed her down the fluorescent hallway as she carried a neatly folded stack of patient charts against her chest, pretending not to notice the whispers drifting from the nurse's station. Someone muttered that the new hire looked too quiet to survive a weekend shift. Another joked that she would probably ask where the coffee machine was before finding the trauma room. No one bothered lowering their voice. They assumed silence meant weakness. They assumed a woman with gentle eyes and an old wristwatch worn smooth by years of use had nothing remarkable hidden beneath her pale blue scrubs. The emergency department never waited for introductions. Stretchers rolled past with squeaking wheels, monitors chirped in uneven rhythms, overhead speakers called for physicians from every direction, and the scent of antiseptic mixed with stale coffee floated through the crowded corridors. It was organized chaos, the kind that swallowed hesitation within seconds. The new nurse simply nodded when the charge nurse handed her a patient list that should have belonged to someone with years of experience. She accepted it without complaint, studying every name only once before folding the paper into her pocket with deliberate care. Her movements were economical, almost effortless, as though every step had already been practiced hundreds of times. That strange composure only fueled the jokes. One orderly leaned toward another and whispered that she walked like someone inspecting a parade instead of treating patients. A respiratory therapist chuckled and said she would not be smiling by lunchtime. She heard every word. She answered none of them. Her name badge identified her only as Emily Carter, registered nurse. Beneath it hung a hospital identification card that still looked freshly printed. To everyone around her, she was another replacement hired to fill a staffing shortage. Another face that would probably disappear within 6 months. The emergency department had seen plenty of those. Patients, however, noticed different things. An elderly man struggling to breathe relaxed when she knelt beside him instead of towering over him. She adjusted his oxygen tubing before anyone asked, noticed his trembling hands, and quietly wrapped a warm blanket around his shoulders. A frightened little boy stopped crying after she crouched to his eye level and explained every sound the heart monitor would make before attaching a single wire. A woman holding pressure against a deep cut realized the bleeding had slowed only after Emily silently repositioned the dressing with practiced precision. She never drew attention to herself. She simply moved from room to room, leaving each patient a little calmer than before. The physicians began noticing something unusual. She anticipated requests before they were spoken. Instruments appeared exactly when needed. Medication calculations were correct without hesitation. During a difficult cardiac case, she identified a subtle change on the monitor almost 10 seconds before the machine triggered its alarm. The attending physician glanced at her with mild surprise, wondering how someone supposedly fresh out of orientation had caught something so quickly. Emily merely nodded toward the screen, her expression unchanged. There was no pride in it. Only focus. Between emergencies she checked the old watch on her wrist, not for the time, but almost by instinct, as though confirming something only she understood. The watch was scratched, its leather strap faded from years of wear. Most assumed it had sentimental value. None imagined it had once accompanied her through nights when every second meant the difference between life and death. During lunch break, which lasted barely 7 minutes before another trauma alert echoed through the department, she sat alone near the ambulance entrance with an untouched sandwich. She watched paramedics unload patients with quiet attention, unconsciously scanning rooftops, traffic flow, and every moving vehicle before returning inside. A passing security guard noticed the habit and frowned for a moment, unable to explain why it seemed oddly familiar. The afternoon intensified. A multi-vehicle highway collision flooded the emergency department with injured families. Voices overlapped. Phones rang continuously. Blood stained freshly mopped floors almost as quickly as they were cleaned. Staff members rushed in every direction, and for the first time that day the joking stopped. Everyone was simply trying to keep people alive. Emily slipped naturally into the rhythm. She stabilized an unconscious teenager while calmly directing 2 newer nurses through procedures they had nearly forgotten under pressure. She caught a medication dosage error before it reached a patient. She gently redirected a panicked father away from a trauma room moments before he would have interrupted a critical intervention. No one realized how often she prevented disasters because prevention rarely earned applause. It simply made catastrophe invisible. Even the physician who had doubted her earlier found himself following her suggestions without thinking. She never argued. She merely observed. Then offered exactly the right solution at exactly the right moment. As evening approached, exhaustion settled over the department like heavy fog. Coffee cups multiplied across counters. Stretchers lined the hallways. Rain tapped softly against the emergency entrance, turning the parking lot into shimmering reflections beneath the gray sky. Emily stepped outside for less than a minute to help paramedics unload an elderly accident victim. As she looked upward, her eyes paused on the clouds. The expression crossing her face lasted only an instant. Recognition. Calculation. Then it disappeared. Inside, another nurse noticed and laughed lightly. "Looking for sunshine already?" Emily smiled politely but said nothing. Minutes later, the faint vibration arrived first. Barely noticeable. A low pulse beneath the building itself. She stopped writing halfway through a patient note. Around her, no one else reacted. The vibration grew stronger. Windows trembled. Ceiling lights quivered almost imperceptibly. Several staff members exchanged confused looks before the unmistakable thunder of helicopter rotors rolled across the hospital grounds. The emergency department erupted into motion. Doctors assumed another airlift trauma was inbound. Orderlies rushed stretchers toward the helipad entrance. Security officers hurried outside. Emily remained perfectly still for one heartbeat, her fingers resting lightly against the worn watch on her wrist. Her breathing slowed instead of quickening. The helicopter settled onto the landing pad with unusual precision, its powerful rotors whipping rain across the pavement. But something immediately felt different. Instead of unloading a patient, 2 Navy crew members climbed out first, scanning the entrance with urgent determination. They ignored the physicians waiting beside trauma equipment. They ignored hospital administrators rushing forward. One of them stepped inside the emergency department, removed his flight helmet, and spoke loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "We need Nurse Emily Carter immediately. The request comes directly from command." Silence swallowed the emergency room. Every conversation stopped. Every monitor seemed suddenly louder. The sane co-workers who had laughed at her only hours earlier slowly turned toward the quiet nurse standing near the trauma bay, and for the first time all day, Emily's calm expression revealed the faintest shadow of a past she had worked very hard to leave behind. She did not answer immediately. The request hung in the air as if even the machines surrounding the emergency department were waiting for her response. Conversations dissolved into uneasy silence. The charge nurse looked from the Navy crewman to Emily, expecting confusion, denial, perhaps an explanation that would make sense of the impossible scene unfolding before them. Instead, Emily quietly removed the pen from her pocket, placed it on the nurse's station with careful precision, and took one slow breath. There was no surprise in her eyes. Only recognition. The same recognition that had crossed her face when she looked toward the clouds minutes earlier. "I'm Emily Carter," she said softly. The Navy crewman nodded once, the crisp motion carrying the weight of old familiarity rather than formal introduction. "Ma'am, we need you now." Every pair of eyes followed her as she stepped toward the entrance. The physician who had supervised her orientation hurried beside her. "Emily, what's going on? Why would the Navy be asking for a brand new emergency nurse?" She hesitated for the briefest moment before answering without slowing her pace. "Because I'm not the person you think I am." The words landed with quiet force. Outside, rain lashed across the helipad as the helicopter's rotors continued turning. Standing beside the aircraft was a senior naval officer whose uniform was soaked by the weather, yet he paid no attention to it. The moment Emily approached, he straightened instinctively. It was not theatrical. It was respect earned long ago. "Commander Carter," he said. "We were afraid we wouldn't reach you in time." The nearby hospital staff froze. "Commander." The title echoed through stunned minds that only hours earlier had dismissed her as inexperienced. Emily lowered her eyes briefly before responding. I haven't used that title in 3 years. The officer's expression softened. I know. But today we need the woman who did. Before anyone could ask another question, the helicopter doors opened. Inside lay a critically injured man surrounded by military medics working with desperate speed. Blood soaked the bandages across his chest. Portable monitors flashed unstable rhythms. One medic looked up the instant Emily climbed aboard. Relief spread across his exhausted face. Thank God, he whispered. She's here. The civilian doctors instinctively moved to assist, but one glance told them something extraordinary was happening. The military medical team was waiting for Emily's direction. Not because of protocol. Because they trusted her judgment without hesitation. She scanned the patient once. One look at the injuries. One look at the monitor. One look at the medications already administered. Lower the norepinephrine, she instructed calmly. Prepare blood warmer. Chest decompression kit now. Someone call the operating room before we move him. Her voice was steady, controlled, unmistakably authoritative. No hesitation. No uncertainty. The medics moved instantly. The civilian physicians exchanged astonished glances. She had identified problems in seconds that most specialists would have needed precious minutes to confirm. The senior trauma surgeon quietly stepped beside her. You've done this before. Emily never looked away from the patient. More times than I ever wanted to. They rolled the stretcher through the emergency entrance. The laughter that had filled these hallways only hours earlier had vanished completely. Nurses who had mocked her now cleared corridors without being asked. Physicians listened instead of questioned. The emergency department itself seemed to shift around her, as though it recognized a leader no one had known was standing among them all day. Yet beneath her calm expression lived something heavier than pressure. It was memory. Every flashing light reflected another battlefield hospital. Every metallic scent awakened another night when helicopters arrived carrying soldiers balanced between life and death. Every alarm pulled fragments of a life she had spent years trying to bury beneath ordinary work and quiet anonymity. She had left military medicine with a promise to herself. No interviews. No medals displayed. No stories. She wanted patients to see only a nurse, never a decorated combat trauma commander whose hands had carried impossible decisions across too many wars. That promise had protected her peace. Until today. The patient suddenly deteriorated. Blood pressure collapsed. Cardiac rhythm became dangerously unstable. The room erupted into movement. We're losing him, someone shouted. Emily stepped closer. No panic, she said. He's still telling us how to save him. Her hands moved with astonishing confidence. Every instruction was precise. Every second mattered. Then, unexpectedly, she stopped. Just for a heartbeat. The room fell into an almost sacred silence. No one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, and the faint electronic beeping struggling against the patient's failing heart. Emily looked closely at the man's face beneath the swelling and dried blood. Years had changed him. Gray now touched his hair. Deep lines marked the corners of his eyes. But there was something unmistakable. A scar above his left eyebrow. A small crescent shape that memory recognized before logic could. Her breathing caught almost invisibly. Captain Hayes, she whispered. The senior officer standing behind her closed his eyes. You remember? Emily nodded slowly. Images flooded back with painful clarity. A mountain valley. Smoke thick enough to hide the sky. The sound of incoming fire. A helicopter crippled before it ever reached safety. She remembered lying trapped beneath twisted metal, unable to move as flames spread across shattered wreckage. She remembered believing those were the last moments of her life. And then one man had run back into the burning crash while everyone else sought cover. One man had ignored direct orders to retreat. One man had dragged her out through fire and collapsing debris before carrying her across open ground under enemy fire. Captain Daniel Hayes. He had saved her life that day and disappeared into another deployment before she could ever properly thank him. She had searched for him afterward, only to learn he had continued serving in silence, refusing recognition just as she had. The room remained still as realization settled over everyone present. The Navy had not searched the country for the nearest specialist. They had searched for one specific person because the wounded officer himself, drifting in and out of consciousness during the flight, had repeated only one name again and again. Emily. Find Emily. Even while fighting for his own life, he had remembered the woman whose life he once carried from the fire. She closed her eyes for a single second before opening them with renewed determination. "We're not losing him today," she said quietly. "He already gave me one lifetime. I'm giving everything I have to protect his." Around her, every member of the emergency team understood they were witnessing far more than an extraordinary medical case. They were watching a debt of gratitude measured not in words but in years. And as the operating room doors opened ahead, another revelation quietly settled over the stunned hospital staff. The woman they had mistaken for an ordinary new nurse had never come to their hospital to escape greatness. She had come because after saving countless strangers in war, she believed the greatest honor left was saving ordinary people who would never know her name. Then the cardiac monitor emitted a sharp, terrifying alarm, and as the surgical team rushed the stretcher through the operating room doors, Emily saw something tucked inside Captain Hayes's blood-stained uniform pocket that made her stop in disbelief. A carefully folded letter with her name written across the front in handwriting she had not seen in 3 long years. The operating room doors closed behind them with a heavy thud that seemed to separate 2 different worlds. Outside, anxious staff members waited in stunned silence, still struggling to reconcile the quiet nurse they had teased that morning with the composed commander now directing one of the most critical surgeries the hospital had ever witnessed. Inside, time narrowed into heartbeats, measured not by clocks but by monitors, steady hands, and the fragile rhythm of a life refusing to surrender. Emily slipped on a fresh pair of sterile gloves, and the years she had tried so carefully to leave behind returned without resistance. Every movement became instinct. Every decision carried the confidence of someone who had stood in places where hope often arrived on helicopter blades and disappeared just as quickly. Yet this time, the battle was different. This was not about duty to a mission. It was about a promise that had never been spoken aloud. Captain Daniel Hayes had once carried her out of a burning wreckage when every logical decision said he should have saved himself. Now fate had quietly returned the debt to her hands. The room moved as one organism. Surgeons anticipated her observations before she finished speaking. Anesthesiologists adjusted medications at the exact moment she requested them. Nurses who had never met her before trusted her completely, not because of rank or reputation, but because calm has a language of its own, and everyone in that room could hear it. The bleeding was relentless. Every few moments another suction canister filled. Blood transfusions continued. The patient's blood pressure climbed only to fall again. Fatigue began creeping into every face except Emily's. She never raised her voice. She never hurried her words. She simply continued placing one correct decision after another, like carefully laid stones across a dangerous river. Outside the operating suite, the emergency department had changed in ways no policy manual could ever accomplish. The nurses who had laughed earlier replayed every careless remark in their minds with growing embarrassment. One remembered joking about how long the new hire would last. Another remembered rolling her eyes when Emily quietly reorganized emergency supplies without being asked. None of those memories felt harmless anymore. They felt painfully small. The charge nurse stood near the viewing window and quietly admitted to the trauma surgeon beside her. "She never tried to prove us wrong." The surgeon nodded. "She never needed to." Nearly 4 hours passed before the monitor suddenly dipped again. A dangerous silence settled across the room as every eye fixed on the fading numbers. For a brief moment no one spoke. No instruments moved. The only sound was the soft mechanical breath of the ventilator filling the room with measured patience. Emily looked at Captain Hayes's face, bruised almost beyond recognition, and remembered another silence years earlier. It had existed inside a burning valley after the explosion stopped, when she had opened her eyes expecting darkness and instead found a stranger refusing to abandon her. He had not known her name then. He had simply believed one life was worth risking another. She leaned closer and spoke softly enough that only those nearest could hear. "You carried me when I couldn't stand. It's my turn now." Then she looked up. Again. The team moved instantly. Another intervention. Another carefully timed procedure. Another desperate attempt. Seconds stretched into impossibly long moments. Then, almost unnoticed at first, the monitor steadied. The blood pressure rose. The heartbeat found its rhythm again. One steady tone became another. Then another. Relief spread through the operating room, not with cheers, but with quiet exhalations from professionals who understood how precious ordinary sounds could be. The crisis had passed. Hours later, dawn painted pale gold across the hospital windows as Captain Hayes was transferred safely to intensive care. He remained unconscious, but he was alive. That single fact felt larger than every medal hanging in forgotten display cases across distant military buildings. Emily finally removed her gloves and walked into the empty consultation room carrying the folded letter recovered from his uniform. Her hands, steady throughout the entire operation, trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The paper was worn at the edges, as though it had traveled for a very long time. The first sentence stopped her breath. "If you're reading this, then life has given us another meeting I wasn't sure either of us would ever see." She continued reading through blurred vision. Hayes wrote that after the rescue years before, he had followed her career from a respectful distance, hearing stories from medics whose lives she had quietly changed across different deployments. He knew she had resigned her commission without ceremony. He knew she had chosen a small civilian hospital instead of prestigious appointments. Most of all, he wrote that he had never believed she owed him anything. He had simply hoped she would find the peaceful life that war had taken from so many others. Near the end of the letter, one sentence lingered longer than the rest. "The bravest people are rarely the loudest. They're usually the ones who quietly return to serving after the world has already thanked them." Emily closed her eyes as tears finally escaped, not from grief, but from the release of carrying memories that had remained unspoken for years. When Captain Hayes regained consciousness 2 days later, the first face he saw was hers. His smile was weak, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I figured," he murmured, "if anyone could argue with death long enough to make it listen, it would be you." Emily smiled through damp eyes. "You started the argument years ago." Neither of them mentioned debts. Neither spoke about heroism. Some acts of kindness become too deep for language. Word of what had happened spread quietly through the hospital, though Emily requested that no ceremony be held and no special recognition be arranged. She returned to ordinary shifts as soon as Captain Hayes was stable, checking 4 lines, comforting frightened children, helping elderly patients sit up in bed, and reassuring worried families exactly as she had before the helicopter arrived. The only difference was the way her coworkers looked at her now. Their respect no longer came from discovering her extraordinary past. It came from realizing she had never once used that past to make herself feel greater than anyone else. One afternoon, the same orderly who had laughed on her first day found her restocking supplies alone. He hesitated before speaking. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I judged someone I didn't know." Emily placed another package onto the shelf and offered the same gentle smile she had worn from the beginning. "We're all carrying chapters other people haven't read yet." The words settled into the hallway with remarkable simplicity. Weeks later, the familiar sound of helicopter blades echoed across the hospital once more. Staff members instinctively looked toward the sky, but this time the aircraft never landed. It simply circled once above the building before continuing toward the horizon. Emily stepped outside for a brief moment, and watched it disappear into the morning light. She touched the old watch on her wrist, then returned inside before another patient could wait too long. Life had not become easier. Hospitals would always know heartbreak, impossible choices, and days when effort could not overcome fate. But compassion remained undefeated because someone was always willing to show up for another human being. Sometimes the greatest courage wears a uniform. Sometimes it wears simple blue scrubs. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one no one notices until the moment everyone needs them most. If this story stayed with you, perhaps carry one small kindness into someone else's ordinary day, because the quietest acts are often the ones remembered longest. As the hospital doors opened to welcome another uncertain morning, the fading echo of distant rotor blades blended with the steady rhythm of lives being saved, leaving behind the gentle reminder that true honor rarely asks to be recognized. It simply keeps answering when someone calls its name.